Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 10, Part 2. It looked just the same, except that it may perhaps have shrunk a little in my eyes. And Mrs. Gummidge was waiting at the door as if she had stood there ever since. All within was the same, down to the seaweed in the blue mug in my bedroom. I went into the outhouse to look about me, and the very same lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, possessed by the same desire to pinch the world in general, appeared to be in the same state of conglomeration in the same old corner. But there was no little Emily to be seen, so I asked Mr. Peggotty where she was. "She's at school, sir," said Mr. Peggotty, wiping the heat consequent on the porterage of Peggotty's box from his forehead. "She'll be home," looking at the Dutch clock, "in 20 minutes to half an hour's time. We all on us feel the loss of her, bless ye." Mrs. Gummidge moaned. "Cheer up, mother," cried Mr. Peggotty. "I feel it more than anybody else," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I'm a lorn creature. And she used to be almost the only thing that didn't go contrary with me." Mrs. Gummidge, whimpering and shaking her head, applied herself to blowing the fire. Mr. Peggotty, looking round upon us while she was so engaged, said in a low voice, which he shaded with his hand, "The old un." From this I rightly conjectured that no improvement had taken place since my last visit in the state of Mrs. Gummidge's spirits. Now, the whole place was, or it should have been, quite as delightful a place as ever, and yet it did not impress me in the same way. I felt rather disappointed with it. Perhaps it was because little Emily was not at home. I knew the way by which she would come, and presently found myself strolling along the path to meet her. A figure appeared in the distance before long, and I soon knew it to be Emily, who was a little creature still in stature, though she was grown. But when she drew nearer, and I saw her blue eyes looking bluer, and her dimpled face looking brighter, and her whole self prettier and gayer, a curious feeling came over me that made me pretend not to know her, and pass by as if I were looking a long way off. I have done such a thing since in later life, or I am mistaken. Little Emily didn't care a bit. She saw me well enough, but instead of turning round and calling after me, ran away, laughing. This obliged me to run after her, and she ran so fast that we were very near the cottage before I caught her. "Oh, it's you, is it?" said little Emily. "Why, you knew who I was, Emily," said I. "And didn't you know who I was?" said Emily. I was going to kiss her, but she covered her cherry lips with her hands and said she wasn't a baby now, and ran away, laughing more than ever, into the house. She seemed to delight in teasing me, which was a change in her I wondered at very much. The tea-table was ready, and our little locker was put out in its old place, but instead of coming to sit by me, she went and bestowed her company upon that grumbling Mrs. Gummidge, and on Mr. Peggotty's inquiry why, rumpled her hair all over her face to hide it, and could do nothing but laugh. "A little puss it is," said Mr. Peggotty, patting her with his great hand. "Ha! So she is, cried Ham. "Master Davy bore, so she is." And he sat and chuckled at her for some time in a state of mingled admiration and delight that made his face a burning red. Little Emily was spoiled by them all, in fact, and by no one more than Mr. Peggotty himself, whom she could have coaxed into anything by only going and laying her cheek against his rough whisker. That was my opinion, at least, when I saw her do it, and I held Mr. Peggotty to be thoroughly in the right. But she was so affectionate and sweet-natured, and had such a pleasant manner of being both sly and shy at once, that she captivated me more than ever. She was tender-hearted, too, for when, as we sat round the fire after tea, an allusion was made by Mr. Peggotty over his pipe to the loss I had sustained, the tears stood in her eyes, and she looked at me so kindly across the table that I felt quite thankful to her. "Ah," said Mr. Peggotty, taking up her curls and running them over his hand like water. "Here's another orphan, you see, sir. And here," said Mr. Peggotty, giving Ham a backhanded knock in the chest, "is another of them, though he don't much like it." "If I had you for my guardian, Mr. Peggotty," said I, shaking my head, "I don't think I should feel much like it." "Well said, Master Davy Moore," cried Ham in an ecstasy. "Hoorah! Well said! Nor more you wouldn't, hor!" Here he returned Mr. Peggotty's backhander, and little Emily got up and kissed Mr. Peggotty. "And how's your friend, sir?" said Mr. Peggotty to me. "Steerforth," said I. "That's a name," cried Mr. Peggotty, turning to Ham. "I knowed it was something in our way." "You said it was Rutherford," observed Ham, laughing. "Well," retorted Mr. Peggotty, "and you steer with a rudder, don't you? I ain't far off. How is he, sir?" "He was very well indeed when I came away, Mr. Peggotty." "There's a friend," said Mr. Peggotty, stretching out his pipe. "There's a friend, if you talk of friends. Why, Lord love my heart alive, it ain't a treat to look at him." "He is very handsome, is he not?" said I, my heart warming with this praise. "Handsome!" cried Mr. Peggotty. "He stands up to you like a... Why, I don't know what he does stand up to you like. He's so bold." "Yes, that's just his character," said I. "He's as brave as a lion, and you can't think how frank he is, Mr. Peggotty." "And I do suppose now," said Mr. Peggotty, looking at me through the smoke of his pipe, "that in the way of book learning he'd take the wind out of almost anything." "Yes," said I, delighted. "He knows everything. He is astonishingly clever." "There's a friend," murmured Mr. Peggotty, with a grave toss of his head. "Nothing seems to cost him any trouble," said I. "He knows a task if he only looks at it. He is the best cricketer you ever saw. He will give you almost as many men as you like at draughts and beat you easily." Mr. Peggotty gave his head another toss, as much as to say, "Of course he will." "He is such a speaker," I pursued, "that he can win anybody over. And I don't know what you'd say if you were to hear him sing, Mr. Peggotty." Mr. Peggotty gave his head another toss, as much as to say, "I have no doubt about it." "Then he's such a generous, fine, noble fellow," said I, quite carried away by my favourite theme, "that it's hardly possible to give him as much praise as he deserves. I am sure I can never feel thankful enough for the generosity with which he has protected me, so much younger and lower in the school than himself." I was indeed running on very fast when my eyes rested on little Emily's face, which was bent forward over the table, listening with the deepest attention, her breath held, her blue eyes sparkling like jewels, and the colour mantling in her cheeks. She looked so extraordinarily earnest and pretty that I stopped in a sort of wonder. And they all observed her at the same time, for as I stopped, they laughed and looked at her. "Emily is like me," said Peggotty, "and would like to see him." Emily was confused by our all observing her, and hung down her head, and her face was covered with blushes. Glancing up presently through her stray curls, and seeing that we were all looking at her still, for I am sure, for one, I could have looked at her for hours, she ran away, and kept away till it was nearly bedtime. I lay down in the old little bed in the stern of the boat, and the wind came moaning on across the flat, as it had done before. But I could not help fancying now that it moaned of those who were gone. And instead of thinking that the sea might rise in the night and float the boat away, I thought of the sea that had risen since I last heard those sounds, and drowned my happy home. I recollect as the wind and water began to sound fainter in my ears, putting a short clause into my prayers, petitioning that I might grow up to marry little Emily, and so dropping lovingly asleep. The days passed pretty much as they had passed before, except, it was a great exception, that little Emily and I seldom wandered on the beach now. She had tasks to learn and needlework to do, and was absent during a great part of each day. But I felt that we should not have had those old wanderings, even if it had been otherwise. Wild and full of childish whims as Emily was, she was more of a little woman than I had supposed. She seemed to have got a great distance away from me in little more than a year. She liked me, but she laughed at me and tormented me, and when I went to meet her, stole home another way, and was laughing at the back door when I came back, disappointed. The best times were when she sat quietly at work in the doorway, and I sat on the wooden step at her feet, reading to her. It seems to me at this hour that I have never seen such sunlight as on those bright April afternoons, that I have never seen such a sunny little figure as I used to see, sitting in the doorway of the old boat, that I have never beheld such sky, such water, such glorified ships sailing away into golden air. Thanks so much for joining me. More tomorrow at the same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram for the last part of Chapter 10. And if you miss any of the chapters, please go to the YouTube channel Fireside Reading, where we upload all the chapters as they come along, and all the chapters of all the books we've read are there. So please take a listen and a look if you'd like. Until I see you all again tomorrow, please stay very well.